Hi, friends. Welcome back to Across the Divide. In this episode, I have a conversation with Mike Bird. If you haven't heard this name before, he is a prominent biblical theologian and New Testament professor at Ridley College in Australia. He's the author of multiple books on the New Testament, including The Gospel of Lord, How the Early Church Wrote the Story of Jesus, Evangelical Theology, and more recently, a book that he co-authored with N.T. Wright, another prominent New Testament professor, titled The New Testament in Its World. You might be interested to know why a New Testament professor would be in conversation with me. Actually, this is a really interesting dialogue we had. He shares about his background and interest in Palestine and Israel, his encounters with Palestinian Christians, and how those encounters impacted the way that he thinks now about what's happening in the land. And also, we discuss the responsibility of Christians, whether in seminaries, in churches, and anyone else, their responsibility to speak up for peace and for justice. And also, as a New Testament professor, he gives important advice for us on how to think biblically, but more crucially, how to use the Bible well in our understanding, reflection, interpretation of what's happening around us. Really important advice from a well-known New Testament professor who's very helpfully engaging with the scriptures, but also has a heart for peace and for justice, and also very concerned about the travesty in Gaza. A really fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope you would enjoy it as well. Also, if you like this work, if you like the conversations we're having on the podcast, consider becoming Patreon supporters. That support is really essential for the work we're doing, keeps us going, sustains our work. And also, as a Patreon supporters, you get some extra cool and fun perks, like conversations with us as hosts, some discounts on merchandise, and also some extra content. So if you're interested in doing that, consider becoming a supporter on patreon.com/across the divide. So here's my conversation with Mike Bird. Mike Bird, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be with you, Dr. Daniel.
That's right.
Fresh from your PhD defense and now a man of letters and great intellectual credentials. So let me be one of the first guests to congratulate you on completing your doctorate.
Thank you, Mike. That's very generous of you. Yeah, it's still fresh and I'm still getting used to it, but I appreciate the sentiment. Okay, so Mike, I came across you only recently. I'm a fan of N.T. Wright, and I listened to a conversation you had with him, and there was a question on the podcast from a Christian from Gaza. I think her name was Lydia. And you were so gracious to read the whole question. It was a very long question, and you read it, put it on the screen. Mm. And I was just struck by your empathy and some of the stuff that you said afterwards, after N.T. Wright's response. So I was like, hey, I need to reach out to Mike Bird. Then I looked you up, and I was like, wow, I need to talk to Mike Bird. He's great. He's actually a prominent person in New Testament studies, a scholar of the Bible. And it was a refreshing experience for me to hear a theologian, a Bible scholar, who actually paid attention, who actually cares about this issue. There's a tendency in the field, and we'll talk about this later, but there's a tendency to be too esoteric and too stuck in our research and not pay attention to the world, especially what's happening in Palestine and Israel. But before we unpack that, I'm kind of curious, how come you as a Bible scholar got interested in the Palestine-Israel issue? Like, what's the story there behind that?
Well, part of it comes down to my previous career when I served in the Australian military and in military intelligence. So I was in the army in the 1990s. So this is after the Gulf War, where you have the beginnings of the global war on terror, which then climaxes in 9/11. Okay, so I was in the army just before and just after 9/11, where everyone suddenly developed a very big interest in Islam, jihadism, and the way it was expressed around the world. So we were learning about Al-Qaeda. We were learning about the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims. We were learning about Hezbollah, Hamas, Fatah, the Muslim Brotherhood, and all the various spin-offs. We were concerned about how they could manifest in Australia. We have had a few incidents of jihadist violence in Australia. There was an attempted bomb plot at St. Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne, Australia. So I was sort of interested in that way. But it even goes back further than that. The Australian military was involved in World War One, including the British campaign in Palestine. And it was because the Queensland Mounted Infantry won the Battle of Beersheba is that the British were then able to defeat the Ottomans and Germans and effectively take over Palestine, which then led to the British Mandate, Balfour Declaration, everything like that. So Australia has been involved in that element of Middle Eastern politics for a long time. So that's how I first got into it, through the concern about international security, military intelligence, and Islamic terrorism. So that was the background. But I was also a Christian at the same time. And I naturally was attuned to the religious dimensions of these conflicts. A lot of my peers just assumed that all religion leads to some kind of extremism. And if only you could get religion out of the Middle East, it would make everything better, which I said, that's like, if you got rid of all the sand out of the Middle East, then everything would be fine. Religion is more like atmosphere. It's not a hobby for people in that part of the world. And that's what I think a lot of Westerners don't understand. Religion is simply part of the substructure of that world. And I was interested in the different Christian communities in that era. And I learned a lot about the spread of Syriac Christianity between Baghdad and Peking, through the Middle Ages, the history of Palestinian Christianity as well, both in the West Bank, Gaza, Galilee. There used to be a very big Christian population in Lebanon. Australia has a very big Lebanese community, so we have a lot of Maronite Christians in Australia. So there was all these sort of things that meant it was on my radar. And I started reading a number of books about Palestinian Christians, one by Elias Shakur, Mitri Racheb, and another other people. And a few New Testament scholars were interested in this issue as well. People like Gary Burge, who's a scholar I know, plus several others were interested in this topic. And the other thing is, and if you are a biblical scholar and if you visit Jerusalem or if you visit Israel, Palestine, you kind of have to face up to the realities that there are Christians in Palestine. And it's not just a matter of Jews and Muslims. There are Christian groups ranging from Messianic Jews, Protestant churches, Catholics, Greek Orthodox, and these. And so if you actually go and visit the Holy Land, you do meet and come across these groups, and they do open up whole new vistas in your perspective. And when you talk to them or read things by them, you learn to see the conflict through their eyes. So that's largely how I've come into it, through a mixture of Australian military history, my own career in the military, and as a biblical scholar working with various Christians around the world who are connected to Israel and Palestine.
I'm kind of wondering if your experience in the military has also affected the way that you have considered the people in the Middle East, if the analysis is coming from a framework of the military and countering what the West calls terrorism. This is an issue. This is a term that is problematic to me, and we can talk about it. But if it's framed within a structure of militarism in response to Islamic militancy and militia war and militia groups and so on, is that I feel that's a disadvantage, right? That because it's framed in a structure of power and military and statehood, and not a human to human kind of experience or analysis, right?
Yeah, coming from a military intelligence vantage point, you view everything through the lens of threat assessment.
Right.
So everything, threat is measured in the metrics of intent plus capability. And so you just assume that Islam and Islamic extremism are the same thing, and you don't understand that there's a big scale of which there is. I mean, Al-Qaeda was a jihadist element. Hamas is more of it's Islamic, but it's more of a nationalist organization. So it's a different species from what Al-Qaeda was. And then you've also got to understand, the nature of political Islam, like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is different again. And then, so you've got a spectrum of groups, and you can't just dump them all in the same category. And then you've got just the average Muslim in your country who wants to, live an ordinary life. And, one thing you've got to explain to people, certainly in the West, is you're about 10,000 times more likely to have your life saved by a Muslim doctor than you are to have it taken by a Muslim terrorist.
Right.
Okay, so that's it. I mean, I've had that many Muslim doctors and nurses over the course of my career. Not very good for pulled pork recipes, but very good for usually very good at their job.
But everything else,
so,
right?
and that's the So, I mean, that's what you have to understand. But particularly, I think after 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and then after 9/11, everything that was Muslim or Islamic was viewed as a threat and differentiated only in degree. And that led to a big reaction. And that meant that anyone who was engaged in opposition against any Muslim majority country or group was going to be viewed as the good guy. So if Islam is engaged in combat or conflict or war with Hamas, Hezbollah, Fatah, Iran, Syria, anyone, if they're fighting Muslims, then Israel must be the good guys, because the script is so that Muslims can only be the bad guys. Right. Now, sometimes they are. I believe sometimes they are. I've seen, if you look at what ISIS and some of the things Al-Qaeda has done, I'm not denying that there are some bad. And I was actually part of the military trying to stop them hurting Australians and Westerners. But that doesn't mean every Muslim you meet is the villain. And it doesn't mean that they cannot themselves be the victim of oppression from other Muslim groups, but also from, the legacy of Western imperialism and, other conflicts in the Middle East, whether it's sectarian or nationalist.
I appreciate you, Mike, highlighting the context. And this is a problem, right? In the West, especially, you tend to flatten people who are different from you, right? Muslims are flat. There's a very simple... I was in a conversation earlier today, is Islam more violent than Christianity? Like, it's a very simple question with a lack of nuance and appreciation of history and of context. And and if you frame the conversation in terms of the Islamic Revolution in Iran and in terms of imperialism and American meddling in Iran before the revolution and the Shah and the coup the US was behind, things, our understanding would become more complex and hopefully would also develop some kind of empathy and understanding why people behave the way they do, and not to justify violence or oppression or any kind of awful behavior, but also to understand that Muslims, just like anyone else, are people who have sincere desires for freedom and for justice and for equality, and people behave differently based on different circumstances. And also at the same time, we have to also reckon with the fact that many Christians in the West, especially in the last 100 years, have been responsible for a lot of suffering, a lot of death, and a lot of killing in the name of Christianity, and if not, justified by Christianity. And whether it's just war theory, whether it's the priests in the battlefield who are blessing and praying for the soldiers, so we have to understand the complexity of people, but also the Middle East, that is a very complex environment and region. There is a bit I really appreciate your perspective, because you have done the work to understand that environment before you can speak about it. And that's really important.
Yeah. Exactly. You need both religious literacy. You've got to understand there's different types of Christianity in the Middle East. There's different types of Islam in the Middle East. So you need religious literacy, but you also need geopolitical literacy. You've got to understand the history of Palestine. I mean, and even knowing that some Christians, some Jews and Christians preferred living in the Ottoman Empire than they did under Catholic monarchs in Europe. They found the Ottoman Empire more tolerant to religious diversity than were some of the Protestant and Catholic rulers in Europe. I mean, there are factors like that people just they can't even understand. And unless you have a basic awareness of that, you're going to view everything through a very simplistic binary lens, or through the lens of a simple threat assessment that all Muslims are dangerous. or anyone from the Middle East is potentially an extremist.
Yeah, I was going to go take us back to the 7th century and the rise of Islam. Non-Chalcedonian Christians were actually happy with the rise of Islam because it rescued them from the tyranny of Chalcedonian Christians, from Catholic and Orthodox Christians. There's the irony of that, right?
And they are some of them. Yeah, and a lot of them provided the navy for Islamic forces in their attack on the Byzantine Empire, because they were largely left to their own devices. They were not persecuted, and yeah, I mean the Islamic expansion, had brought all sorts of complexities with it, and even Islam was in a very much a developmental phase, especially for those first 200 years. People just don't understand that, and it takes a little bit of work. I mean, not everyone can do a PhD in the history of Islam or the Middle East, but having a basic working knowledge that nothing is ever truly simple, I think can stop a lot of people just believing what they hear on social media, television. And I mean, it would be very good if a lot of our politicians, from all around the world, did do a basic course on, religion and history. And it's sad that religion and history departments are the ones that are disappearing from universities when I think they're more needed than ever.
Hi friends, there's an important conference happening soon and I would love for you to attend. It's called Church at the Crossroads, happening on September 11 to 13 in Glen Ellen, right outside of Wheaton, Illinois. This is a first of its kind gathering that comes as a response to the pleas of Palestinian Christians who are asking the Church in North America to take a stand for peace and justice in Palestine and in Israel. It brings together several prominent Palestinian and American pastors, theologians, and speakers, and present an invitation to Christians, especially in the US, to come together for fellowship, learning, reflection, and faithful action. This is especially important when so many Christians have chosen to be silent and apathetic about the war and suffering of the people in Gaza, and many other Christians are complicit and have used the Bible to justify and whitewash that suffering and destruction. Across the Divide is one of the conveners of this conference. Also, I'm one of the speakers, and we are planning to have a get-together for the listeners of Across the Divide. I would love to see you there. So I encourage you to sign up right now at churchatthecrossroads.com. And when you do, type in the coupon ATD, which gives you a 10% registration discount. Again, the coupon is ATD. For more information about the speakers, the program, lodging, and more, again, check out the conference website, churchatthecrossroads.com. I think we're living at a crucial moment in the history of Christianity. And as many Palestinian Christians have been saying, Gaza has revealed a crisis in our faith. Come alongside me and many other Palestinian and American Christians, and let's do the work together. Let's live out the kingdom of God, the kingdom of peace and justice, and let's pursue that hard work of justice and peacemaking. I mean, even if you're not going to be an academic and a scholar and pick up a book and do the scholarly work, at least have the willingness to find complexity and be okay with it, and also understand that people are very similar to each other, and also be aware of our biases and we can talk about this, but Islamophobia is so rife in how people think about, and that also how applies to Palestine. How you think about Muslims makes it very easy for you to dismiss their suffering. So, for example, you have 60,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, the majority of whom are Muslims. That affects people differently in the West than if they were Christians or if they were Jewish, right? So there's a bit of this anti-Arab, anti-Islamic bias that really shapes a lot of the attitudes, I think, in the West. I don't know what you think about that, if that's true or not.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And, people will just view the things through the lens of, like I said, through the lens of 9/11 or whatever it is. Or maybe there was a terrorist incident, somewhere in proximity to them. And that just shapes the way that they view everything. And, learning takes work. Okay. It's easy just to be fed McNuggets from Facebook, Fox News, or CNN, or whoever it is you're getting your news from. But to be able to understand and view conflicts through the eyes of other people takes a bit of work. And a lot of people are sadly lazy or don't have the muscles in their heart to really be able to try think about this from some other person's perspective.
Yeah, that kind of takes me to the next question, which is my own frustration and sadness, really being a Palestinian in the US right now, which is the lack of empathy, if it's not with the Muslims, the Muslim Palestinians in Gaza, but it's also with the Christian church. And you said you had to meet Palestinian Christians, you had to read Ilyas Shakur and Mitri and do the work. But there tends to be also an apathy that is also, or dismissal to the suffering of the Palestinian Christians. So, for example, in Gaza, at least 20 or so Christian Palestinians have been killed by Israeli strikes. I know this wasn't a conversation that you and I had recently. Also, many of them died from lack of medical care, a stroke or a dialysis, or couldn't go get the medical care. But but then I haven't for the life of me, I haven't seen Christians talking about it. Maybe it's me, but and then you talk about the larger structure, 77 years of this, and whether it's the history of 1948, the erasure of Palestinian community, Christian communities in Palestine, the ongoing occupation in the West Bank, the restrictions on basic rights of worship. Like, I couldn't go to Jerusalem to pray as a Palestinian from Bethlehem. Right, so the basic rights that are denied to us as Palestinian Christians, and you wonder, well, okay, politically you can explain why the occupation functions like it does, but then you wonder, well, why aren't my siblings, Christians in the West, paying attention to this issue? How do you make sense of this kind of general apathy for the Palestinian Christians?
I think there's two things going on. You've got a lot of sympathy for the Jews since the Second World War, particularly given the complicity of a number of nations. So whether that was, the Vichy government in France was very anti-Semitic. Even long before the Nazis turned up, there was a long history of anti-Semitism in France. Go back to the Dreyfus affair. Same thing in Austria, Poland. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, and I think a lot of countries, especially in Germany, as you can imagine, trying to compensate for that by being either generally supportive of Israel or extremely supportive of Israel, partly as they see it atoning for their own sins. So that's one background to it. The other hand is when you have this sort of terrorism, whether it's by Al Qaeda, ISIS, or Hamas, like the October 7, that they just see everything through that, and as if that gives Israel carte blanche or a license to kill anyone and everyone. And that was similar to 9/11. Like, we're just going to wreak our revenge on the Arab world. We'll go to Afghanistan, then we'll go back to Iraq. It's almost a need to sate their hunger for revenge in the blood of Muslims and Arabs. And that is sadly, I think, a significant part of it. I think having ignorance that there are Christians in the Middle East. I remember hearing a story of someone met a Palestinian Christian and was astounded by it, and they said, "Well, when did your family come to faith?" Assuming that they'd recently come to faith within the last decade or two. And she said, "Oh, I think it was somewhere time around the first Pentecost, or something." Something like that, as far as our understanding, that there's always been Christians in the Middle East. So that there's just a level of ignorance there, and that means there are things they can't get through. And the best thing that they can happen is usually to meet someone from Palestine who can, in a gentle way, explain to them that there is another side to this conflict. That you may think that they're bombing Hamas, and you could understand why they might think that's a good thing, but it's not just Hamas who is suffering the consequences. It's more likely other people who are innocent and through no fault of their own find themselves now living amidst death and ashes. And it may not be the first conversation they have with a Palestinian Christian. It may be the second or the third one. But eventually they can get to a point where they start to think, I wonder if there's another way to see this when I keep hearing all of these casualties. There can't be 500,000 Hamas fighters running around here. So there's got to be a lot of innocent people suffering. And then when they start watching the media, maybe their heart begins to change and they do start to think that there's another way of understanding this conflict.
And I think I think the Palestinian Christian story complicates that binary that is created, the good guy, the bad guy.
Exactly.
Right. So
exactly.
because
it doesn't fit in.
If I was suffering from ISIS, you would hear the outcry. Oh, Christians are suffering. But if my Muslim neighbor is actually my friend who protects me from the Israeli Jewish forces, then that doesn't sit well with the general narrative, right, in the West of the poor Christian victim who is who's oppressed by Muslims, because actually my oppressor is not a Muslim, it's actually a Jewish person who is supported by Christians. So that it's just an uncomfortable fact for so many people. And that's why it's easier to ignore the Palestinians, especially the Palestinian Christians, than to engage with them.
Yeah, exactly right.
Is there, when it comes to also academic work, and this is my beef with the academy. I'm a product of the academy, and I love my work. I love the scholarship that we do. I love this pursuit of truth, relentless pursuit of desire for understanding of truth. I don't know what you think. I don't know if you have thought about this or not, but it's been a bit hard for me as I was finishing my PhD to be in a very comfortable, good academic setting. But that setting and the people around me who are wonderful and kind and generous, but also are just, I don't know what it is, maybe too busy, too distracted, too academic, too smart to do something or to speak up about what's happening, and that some of that is also tied. It's not to the Bible and how the Bible has been weaponized and used in this recent with what's happening in Gaza. But for those who are Christians who are committed to the work of truth and goodness in the world, when it comes to this catastrophe in Gaza, what has been termed a genocide, and we talked about this, you and I, before, they have chosen to be silent. And for me, it's frustrating because I know examples of in the past of Christians who were silent, and we know the stories from the West, especially from Germany. So it was a bit frustrating for me to see so many wonderful Christians who are just too busy. They have a paper to write, they have a book to write, and they're unwilling to speak up about this issue. And we're going to tackle the Bible in a bit, but it's something that I continue to be frustrated by. So I don't know, like, is there some kind of complicity here of us academics or those who are in the academy or in seminary who are just too busy or too distracted by their work to speak up about such an essential issue like what's happening in Gaza today?
I think there's a number of things. One is if you could call it a little bit of cowardice, because if you do raise your head up, you can get a lot of trouble. And I'm sure in places like Notre Dame, there are a lot of funders of the university that do not want to hear a lot of academics flapping their gums that Israel bad, Palestine good. That the fundraising team might find that hard. So there may be a level of cowardice going on. The other thing you've got to remember, I'm sure there's a lot of academics who maybe have a number of causes they're interested. A lot of them are obviously probably a little bit more agitated about Donald Trump and the sort of the immigration debates going on in America. So then, or racism or gender. So there may be a number of issues taking people's time. But there's also the fear if they get too involved, then that's what they'll be known for. Whereas they would rather be known for other things. And then you've also got like the element of what you could call compassion fatigue. They do feel some for the Palestinians and their plight, but every day you're getting news reports and you end up becoming desensitized to it just because it's another day. Another couple of hundred Palestinians were killed. Same as yesterday. The same thing will happen tomorrow. And I think they feel powerless. But, when you do have the opportunity to say something about this, or if you've got a platform, or if you have whether you're doing a lecture in class and someone asks you a question, you should not shrink away from it. Professors should profess. They should say what they believe rather than say, well, there's option A, there's option B. Meh, pick the one you like and run with that. They should stand for something. And a person with no enemies is a person with no convictions. And I can tell you, Daniel, I have a lot of convictions because I've got a lot of enemies from all sides of the
Sure.
political spectrum. But if you do have a position of privilege, if you do have a position of authority, if you do have a voice that people respect, then you should use that in ways that promote justice, that promote peace and human flourishing. Now, whether you're an assistant professor at a liberal arts college or you're a tenured professor at a major university, I do think your office, your position comes with a certain degree of responsibility. Now, that is not to overtly politicize every academic role. Sometimes we're hired to be academics, to teach, to nurture, to mentor students, but there is nothing wrong if we use our area of speciality to speak towards things that we think are the interests of our fellow human beings, America, and other people of the world. So I think we need to do that. As Martin Luther King said, what he will remember is not just the violence of their adversaries, but the silence of their friends. And we don't want to, go to our graves thinking that when the time came to speak out that we were silent. And simply telling the truth should never be considered a crime. Showing empathy should never be a crime. We can respect different sides of debate, understand everything is complicated, but there's no shame in speaking truth.
Yeah, that's really important. I appreciate what you just said. I also think, Mike, there's also another element, which is the influence of Zionism, of a way of thinking that is very problematic. And this is what I appreciate about Tom Wright, your friend, that even before his conversations with you, I remember his conversations with Justin Briley, where he would answer these questions on Christian Zionism and dispensationalism. And he would, even though he's not maybe politically engaged or involved in this issue concretely, hasn't read the books, but at least he is able to use his education, his reading of Galatians, his reading of Romans, his understanding of the kingdom of God, to say, you know what, this theology is really bad. And I fear that also a lot of this passive, apathetic position for many Christians, whether in the academy but also in churches, and your average Christian, run-of-the-mill Christian, is this inherent kind of Christian Zionism and weaponization of the Bible that says, well, you know what, we need to support Israel no matter what. So there's an element, I think, of, we're busy, we're distracted, to have other things to pay attention to. But I think it seems to me that the influence of Christian Zionism, of this kind of default support for Israel as a state, seems to be in the bread and butter of so many people in the West. So that to pay attention to Palestine is to go against the MO, the zeitgeist for where you are. So to use that the German, to go against the spirit of the age where you live.
Yeah, I mean, you've got different types of Zionism. You've got the political Zionism of various Jewish political parties and their understanding of how the reestablishment of the State of Israel works and what that means in terms of how it deals with its own religious and ethnic divisions, and there's diversities amongst that. But there's also the Christian version of Zionism, which is based on a particular eschatological scheme, like, the end times, and how the resettlement and repopulation of Eretz Israel and Syro-Palestine by Jewish people will somehow lead to the second coming. So it's a very peculiar mix of a very bespoke and somewhat esoteric form of Christian end times theology that has an alarming influence on geopolitics, particularly in North America and amongst Christian groups. So that is the difficult thing you've got to deal with. On the other hand, and this is what we've got to remember too, that criticism of Zionism does not amount to anti-Semitism, and that's kind of what the debates we're having in the West. What's the difference between genuine anti-Semitism, and believe me, we've had some anti-Semitism in Australia this past week, with the burning of a Jewish synagogue, and a Jewish business was burned down. So these are very anti-Semitic acts. There is a difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And unfortunately, in the media, according to some sort of even people who are trying to do censorship, that distinction is not always clear. And while I would wholeheartedly believe in stopping anti-Semitism, simply attacking Jews for being Jews, I think anti-Zionism, or even critique of the Israeli Defense Force and the Netanyahu government, those are legitimate, and that does not amount to anti-Semitism. And I think that's the problem we've got. People don't understand the difference between the two. And I admit as well, I think there are a lot of the pro-Palestine movement themselves are not differentiating the two. Some of the pro-Palestinian groups, at least the ones I've encountered in Australia, are not clothing themselves in a lot of glory when they do engage in anti-Semitic tropes and language and rhetoric. They should be focusing on the Netanyahu government and the way that the IDF is prosecuting its campaign in Gaza, which clearly violates the laws of armed conflict and are committing crimes against humanity simply by the nature of the weapons they're using and how they're deploying them.
If you think the conversations we are having are necessary, then I invite you to consider becoming a monthly Patreon supporter of the podcast on patreon.com/Across the Divide. By sustaining our work, you also get access to various kinds of premium content like extended episode conversations, merch discounts, and private meetings with the hosts of the podcast and other Patreon supporters. So help us to continue growing our small podcast and join the beautiful community of Across the Divide by signing up at patreon.com/Across the Divide. I do appreciate what you're saying about all of that, and I think there is some beautiful stuff that is happening right now of Jews and Muslims and Christians coming together, and Jews themselves saying, "Hey, because of the struggle against anti-Semitism, we are standing along Palestinians, because we are fighting against all of these systems of violence and oppression." So, to be anti-Zionist for them is to be Jewish. It's to be authentically Jewish. And so as long as our struggle is like for justice, for the welfare, for the well-being of people, then we reject anti-Semitism in the same breath as we reject anti-Palestinian bias and bigotry. And we pursue the freedom and the dignity of Jews alongside, not in spite of or instead of, but alongside the liberty and the freedom of Palestinians. I think what concerns me, though, is the weaponization of the scriptures and how that has been used effectively in the last 2 years. I mean, I can tell you from the beginning of the war, where you have Christians quoting Romans 13 to justify the war.
Yeah.
You hear
Netanyahu quoting about eliminate the Amalekites.
The Amalekites taking us back to 1 Samuel 15 and the genocide against the Amalekites, complicated history between the Amalekites and the Israelites, but a very clear commandment to ethnically cleanse and erase all of the Amalekites. But even Christians themselves, I'm hearing Protestants now are, using just war theory. Suddenly it's a very authentically Protestant tradition. And all these kind of usage of the Old Testament and Romans 13 and what have you. And it's frustrating and upsetting, right? That the Bible again is being wielded as a weapon against people. And even we saw this recently with Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz, a well-known politician who's like, I'm supposed to support Israel no matter what. The Bible tells me so. Well, does it? Where does it say that? And to whom did God say that? What's your assessment, especially as someone who's studied the Bible and you continue to do this work? This weaponization seems to me a very alarming phenomenon in many Christian circles.
Yeah, it is. The attempt to use Scripture to justify all sorts of nefarious ends. There's a long history of doing that.
Right.
I mean, people
it's
have
not
always,
new, right?
It's not new. People have been doing it for a long time. So, using Romans 13 saying the Palestinians should obey their governing authorities, the Israeli state or the Netanyahu government. Well, yeah, I mean, how do you obey a government that basically has made it a point of their campaign to eliminate you? Netanyahu intends to keep this war going for as long as possible because he knows once it ends, his political career ends, and he could find himself in trouble nationally and internationally. So I don't think this conflict is going to end anytime soon. I think he wants to drag it out for as long as possible because his own political career and the longevity of his government depends on stretching out this war. That's not just war theory. That's keeping war going for the sake of your own self-interest and political opportunism. So it is sad the way. I mean, the discussion between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz was strange for its bizarreness, and Ted Cruz appealing to the Bible, but not knowing which part of the Bible he was appealing to. That was strange, and it just goes to show that it's very much a shallow, vaguely Protestant type of Christianity that Ted Cruz seems to have an affection for. I mean, he's a guy, I don't think he's really looked at the Bible and Israel and the Palestinian question, anything along those lines. Because there's also stuff in the Bible about for Israel to love the alien and the sojourner in their midst. So I didn't see him quoting those verses when it comes to how you treat different people, who live in around the Jews. So yeah, it was a bizarre debate, and it was like watching to a guy who's got a strong opinion about things he knew nothing about.
Which is so dangerous.
And it's so dangerous, but it can have bad consequences. Yeah. I once met, when I was in the military, I once met a Israeli officer, and this was like mid 1990s, so even before 9/11. And he said to me, he believed in a Palestinian state. It was called Jordan. Mm. And I spoke to him, and he said, yeah, we should just pick up all the Palestinians, just move them to Jordan. Right. I mean, they can have Jordan, and we'll have the rest of it. So, I mean, that was disturbing. It was disturbing that a number of people at the table where we were discussing, whether Christian or non-Christian, kind of agreed with him. The idea, the way to fix this problem is just massive deportation, which I believe is what the Trump regime has proposed. Why don't we just move everyone out of Gaza? Gaza will send some to Egypt, some to Turkey, some to Syria. We'll just liquidate the place, which is a definition of genocide. Whether you, if you depopulate an entire area, either violently or otherwise, or that is a type of genocide because you're removing a whole identity group, a whole tribe, a whole nationality, a whole religious group out of an area. And because people don't understand their own scriptures, or they allow the scriptures to be twisted, they're willing to listen and give biblical sanction to things like that.
I mean, Christians have done that throughout history, right? And even moving Jews out of Europe was also a very good idea for many Christians, right? This is a Jewish problem. What do you do with the Jews in Europe? Well, let's kick them out. It's insane to me that this keeps happening. But to use the Bible in such an easy way, and I'm struck by your phrase that he's so confident about something he doesn't know. And he said, I learned this in church, which is also an indictment against our churches. What are we teaching those kids? But you're teaching them something that obviously is a crime against humanity, whether it's genocide or ethnic cleansing. These are crimes against humanity. But it's easy for that person, for that kid in Sunday school, to take that teaching from Sunday school and apply it geopolitically to mean crimes against humanity. I mean, the insanity of how the Bible has been abused, whether in Sunday school or in seminary or in church sermons, it's insane, and it's super, super scary. And it's a very alarming, I think, phenomenon. I think we need to reckon with this fact here. So what is the best way for Christians to think about the Bible and use the Bible when they think about Palestine and Israel? Here's my answer. maybe quote Jesus, maybe quote Matthew 5, not Romans 13 and First Samuel. But anyway, what's your thought? Like, how do we apply as an exegete and a Bible scholar? Not to spend too much time with hermeneutics, but like, what if, for the average Christian, like, what's the advice you give them to think politically about the scriptures, how to apply it properly to our reality today?
Okay, let me give you what I think about 3 basic rules.
Right.
Number 1, beware of pundits with Bible proof texts. Okay? Beware of pundits with Bible proof texts. Now, whether that's Jon Stewart or whether that's Tucker Carlson or whether it's Sean Hannity, beware of pundits with Bible proof texts. Secondly, you've got to consider
that. What do you mean proof texts?
Okay, so when Ted Cruz quotes Genesis 12, I will bless who bless yous, I will curse who curse yous. Don't assume that they know what they're talking about. Right. They may be ripping verses out of context, or they may not understand the specificity of a particular verse. I mean, you know the thing when people quote Jeremiah 29, 29:11, that, I know the promises I have for you. I don't think that applies to all Christians. I think that was very much about Christians living in Babylon. So
Jews living in Babylon.
The average pundit is not a very well-read Bible scholar or a trained pastor. So beware of pundits with proof texts. Okay. The second thing, you want to know the whole counsel of God. So yes, there was some warfare between the Hebrews and the Canaanites, but that was for a specific time. Once they were settled in the land, they were commanded by the Lord to be compassionate and merciful to the alien and sojourner in their midst. Okay? So, so intertribal warfare was not meant to be the norm. Okay, they were meant to show compassion to people living in their midst. Then you've also got to look at the teaching of Jesus. What did he say about loving your neighbors? If you want to know a good example about how to live with religious and ethnic differences, consider the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's probably a much better model of the way you should think of, say, Muslims. And I think you could argue that Muslims are a type of Samaritan category because they're monotheists. They're not Jewish. They're not Christian. They've got a place for Jesus in their religion. So that they're kind of, initially they were perceived as a Christian sect. Early on, they were thought to be like a bizarre Christian sect. So you've got to think of them as a kind of religious group that is kind of similar to Jews and Christians, but it's different in the same way that the Samaritans were a bit different to Jews. So that's a good category of thinking about them. The other thing you've got to do is be very careful when people use the Bible to support any type of violence, okay? Because generally, certainly in the New Testament and the teaching of Jesus, there is a very big reluctance to do things like seeking revenge. There is just so many injunctions against the Bible about seeking vengeance. It says, leave revenge to God. Now, that doesn't mean that nations cannot defend themselves and, conduct just war or whatever, or conflicts of self-defense, such as is happening in Ukraine. But, be careful where people use the Bible to sanction violence or say things like, with God on our side. When someone says, with God on our side, usually nothing good is coming after that. It usually means with God on our side, we are going to smite our enemies, whether that's the Jews, the Muslims, the natives, the Indians, the immigrants. Nothing good comes after that. So that's some of the basic things you can do. And overall, having a good understanding of biblical theology, that God's promises to Israel were fulfilled in Christ, not in the concrete promise of land. And there's 2 Bible verses I teach my students, Daniel, and that's Paul's speech in Pisidian Antioch in Acts 13, where he says, what God promised our ancestors, he has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising Jesus from the dead. Okay? And then also Paul in 2 Corinthians, where he says, as many as there are of the promises of God, they all find their yes in Jesus Christ. So you've got to think about promise and fulfillment as Christologically centered. God's promises for Israel are fulfilled, not in the establishment of Israel in 1948, but they're established in 30 AD in the coming of the Messiah to Israel and for Israel. That is where that has got to be the locus of God's promises. That's where we see God's faithfulness to Jews and to the world in the coming of the Jewish Messiah, not in the establishment of a secular state some 2,000 years later, which has very different boundaries to ancient Israel, has a secular government and all sorts of things.
There's this conversation in the academy about supersessionism, which is the idea that the church superseded Israel. And I think that they claim, to be a bit cheeky here, but they claim that Israel is a fulfillment of promises. It seems to be a very supersessionist attitude, that the state of Israel supersedes the fulfillment of prophecies in Christ himself. So the state, a secular state that is built on the bones and the homes of the Palestinians, supersedes Christ himself. That actually, ultimately, the fulfillment is not 2,000 years ago. It is actually 1948. But no, these are really good pointers and really good, I think, criteria for us to help us kind of navigate through all of this. Obviously, Mike, and as we can wrap this up, there's work to be done in the academy, in seminaries, in churches, for Christians to think differently. And we see this, like with Ted Cruz. The Ted Cruz phenomenon is very rampant in the church. It seems there's plenty of work ahead of us, whether yourself, myself, and everyone else. And God bless him, Tom Wright, and the work he's doing as well for this public theology that he's doing also on social media and on YouTube and what have you, and podcasting. But it seems I'm getting this kind of urge. There's work to be done in churches, in the church, in the seminary, to think better. It's sad that you still have to quote the Good Samaritan. It's quote that we have to talk about loving the neighbor as ourselves. 2,000 years later, it seems to me that there's actually something at the heart of our faith is being tested. Are we actually being faithful to Christ? Are we being actually serious followers? Is Christ actually Lord when we are in clear disobedience of his commandments? Maybe this is too harsh, Mike. I don't know, but I'm really shook, and I'm really like, I don't know. I don't have the words to make sense of this weaponization of the Bible against not just my people, but anyone, right? Right? Do you get that? Do you support this kind of? There's something that urgent that is kind of emerging from what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, I think there's at one level there is a level of ignorance about who's who in Palestine and what is happening. Okay, there's a level of ignorance. Second thing, you've got people are viewing it through the lens of their politics or a very kind of artificially constructed Christianity, kind of like, because they're into this sort of Christian Zionism. So when you add ignorance, a couple of sermons on Christian Zionism, it doesn't lead to good outcomes where people are going to have it. And the other thing I think we have to acknowledge as well, that some people will feel a definite tension, because on the one hand, they'll say, well, look, I don't support anti-Semitism. I don't like it when some gunman goes into a synagogue and shoots Jews. I don't like the bombing of synagogues. I don't want to see Jewish students attacked at my university campus simply for being Jewish. So there will be sympathy, but then many will have say, but I mean, these images from Gaza are horrific, like dead women and children, and people will be caught in a kind of tension and they just will not know how to resolve it. And I think there's a lot of people who are actually in that position who maybe have moved away from being just anti-Muslim, anti-Palestine, but they find themselves now caught between these two groups. one section where there is sort of some unfortunately some anti-Semitic actors and actions going on, but they will feel that, okay, maybe Israel has gone too far now in their war, it's gone too long, and they just don't know how to resolve it. I think there's a lot of people in that third group, the ones that I have come across. So what I think the task has to be done is, look, there are some people who are not going to change their views. They've been on Christian Zionism since they're in Sunday school, and even if the Lord Jesus came down to them, they would have a hard time believing him. You know, if he said, I actually do love my Palestinian Christians, brothers and sisters, and Muslims are in the image of God too, they would have a hard time swallowing that. But the best thing I think we can do is tell people anti-Semitism, okay, and, you know, giving Israel carte blanche to do as they like in Gaza are not the only options, okay? I think if you can present a third way to people and say there is a Christian perspective on this that, you know, is not married to the sort of, you know, extreme progressive anti-Semitism, and it also recognizes that what Israel is doing is militarily illegal, it's disproportionate, it's unnecessary, it's not the way Western nations are supposed to engage in conflict. There are ways for people. I think if you offer people a third option, that will be very attractive, okay? And I think that will be the way to secure a lot more sympathy, change a lot of minds, change a lot of hearts, and make people think. I mean, when I did the podcast with you for the Holy Post Meter a week ago, I started off by saying to people, look, I don't know if I'm going to change your mind on this, but I just want to make you think. I just want to offer you another perspective. And that's why I interviewed Dr. Daniel for the show. I wanted just people to hear another perspective, because like I said, when people change their mind on something, it's not normally instantaneously. It's when they watch something on the TV about the carnage in Gaza. It's maybe when they read an article by someone they respect, and when they meet a kind of Palestinian Christian for the first time, or then when they listen to a podcast, and it's over time their thinking and their emotional energy, if you like, is transformed. So it's not going to be a one-off encounter. For a lot of people, it's a long process of a lot of, shall we call them, a lot of micro encounters with news people that will suddenly make them think in a different way. And all of a sudden they'll go, you know what? I'm starting to think Daniel was right. I'm starting to think that Tucker Carlson has absolutely no idea what he's talking about.
You mean Ted Cruz?
I'm starting to think, and Ted Cruz. Right. I'm starting to think that my friend who went to Israel and hung out with a Palestinian Anglican family in Jerusalem, maybe I've got more in common with them than I do with some of the strange Zionist movements in my own country. I think it's all those small micro encounters that will get people to change their mind over time. And so that is what I think needs to be done. And that's what I think will happen. So, remember, whether it was securing a Nicene Christology or the abolition movement or whatever it was, these things took decades. And I know that the people in Gaza don't have decades. They're living by hours, days, and months. But the best thing we can do is give people a third option. You don't have to be anti-Semitic. You don't have to be a Zionist. There is another way of approaching this that is particularly faithful to the best of the Christian tradition.
Yeah, really good. And I also, Mike, not to add to what you said, because what you said is perfect and beautiful, but also we have to also reckon with the increase of anti-Semitism, also the increase of Islamophobia. And the amount of
that is true.
Amount of Islamophobia attacks on Muslims, and also on Palestinians, using the word Palestinian as a slur by the president. I don't know if you've been seeing this stuff, and it's so normal. It's not regarded as similar to anti-Semitism. It's so rife in our society. Also, we have to deal with that as well. But yeah, the third way of Jesus, the third way of thinking, in complexity, that, hey, two things could be true at the same time. And actually, if we follow the teachings of Christ, the Sermon on the Mount, the Good Samaritan example, I think there's a better way for us to move forward as believers, as Christians, also as citizens in the world. Really important word, Mike. Thank you so much for your presence here. I really appreciate your perspective. I appreciate the work you're doing. Really thankful for you for this conversation. Thank you.
Daniel, it's great to be with you and all of your listeners.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.